This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on Fabiano Caruana at the 2010 FIDE World Blitz Championship in a pretty tame opening. Magnus Carlsen playing 1d4 and Caruana responding with a Slav as he takes on c4. This is a main line of the Slav defense. And generally, white plays the move e2, e3 here and wins back the pawn on c4. And that is exactly what is happening as Caruana develops his knight to d7. The black dark squared bishop, it generally heads to b4 in these positions. That is a square that was weakened by white's move a2, a4. And white plays a4 to prevent black's b pawn from shifting up to b5. This is still theory, but Magnus making a rare move as far as I know as he moves his pawn from a4 to a5, a very ambitious sideline, trying to grab as much space as possible on the queen side. And he follows it up by occupying the square that was cleared up by the pawn, queen d1 to a4, a very unconventional way of playing. But Caruana, he responds very quickly. And I like the way he responds as he moves his queen from d8 to e7, stabilizing the bishop on b4 and both sides castling kingside. And this looks like it's going to be a long, brutal positional struggle as both sides have castled to the same side. And Magnus moving his bishop away from c4 to e2. That is a very typical Magnus move, kind of a mysterious bishop move. And why is he vacating the c4 square? I think he was trying to defend against the prospect of Fabi pushing the b pawn up to b5. That would have led to a fork on the queen and the bishop. Magnus could have unpassanted there, but he faced the prospect of losing his light squared bishop, and that is one of white's most important pieces in this complex middle game. How is Fabi going to improve his position? Well, there's the answer as he moves his knight from f6 to e4, an ambitious move in his own right, offering a trade of knights, but controlling key central squares with his minor pieces. And now he is threatening to take Carlsen's knight on c3 twice and win a pawn. So my guess is that Magnus has to respond to that threat. He's going to have to do something about his c3 knight, and he does something indeed. And what he does, he moves his queen back to b3. And then he made that move with authority as he defends the knight on c3 and continues to keep the pressure alive on Fabi's dark squared bishop. And the battle is revolving around who can control key central squares. And will Carlsen be able to repel Fabi's queenside pressure? Will he be able to ultimately get rid of that dark squared bishop, which is pestering Magnus on b4? And there's the answer. As Fabi gets rid of that bishop himself, there was something he didn't like about the pressure the queen was exerting on the bishop. And that is why Fabi put his rook on b8. He did that in order to defend the b7 pawn and make the bishop retreat possible. In a trade now on e4, as Fabi maintains his big time advantage and Carlsen drops his other knight back to d2, still playing pretty quietly, still aiming for the long-term positional game here as he chases the bishop out of the center, and Fabi can put it back to g6. He can also put it on d5. But if he does that, then he runs the risk of the bishop getting trapped if Magnus pushes his e-pawn up to e4. But, yep, Caruana going bishop back to g6, and that was the idea of Magnus's last move as the knight is maneuvered from f3 to c4, putting pressure on the other bishop. And now Magnus could try bishop d2 in order to try to snuggle that bishop up to b4 and skewer Fabi's queen and rook, and that is exactly what he does. That is a threat which must be addressed. Fabi can move the rook from f8. He can also move his queen, but the big threat is Carlsen jumping up to b4, and rook fd8 is indeed on the board. Carlsen could still put his bishop on b4. That looks like a very nice square for his dark squared bishop, and I like the way that Carlsen is handling the middle game. He's developed something of an initiative as he forces Fabi's queen out into the open, and the queen lands on g5, x-raying the pawn on g2. So Carlsen, he cannot fall asleep on the prospect of certain kingside threats that can eventually appear if Fabi moves more of his pieces toward the kingside. And Carlsen taking a long thing here as he looks for ways to continue improving his position. He can bring the rook on a1 into the game. He decides instead to put the bishop on a better square, bishop e2 to f3. That was also preventing Fabi's own bishop from jumping back into e4 and threatening checkmate on g2, a good prophylactic move. And there's also the prospect of the a5 pawn pushing up to a6 and weakening the c6 pawn because Fabi, that c6 pawn is defended by the b7 pawn. So Fabi faces the prospect of queenside pressure in the center. I think black is slightly worse here, and Caruana has to play very, very carefully in the next couple of moves. Magnus has always been a legend in these types of quiet maneuvering games, and he's proving that yet again as Fabi now taking a long thing here, trying to figure out a way to keep his position stable. He's got many options here. He can play the move a6 himself, and he does just that, immobilizing Carlsen's pawn on a5. But the drawback of that move is that a hole has been created on b6, and that is a later outpost for white's knight. At the moment, that square is safely defended right now by Fabi's bishop as the knight drops into f6, and maybe Fabi is flirting with the idea of some pressure on Carlsen's king. Maybe a bishop e4 move could come. But Carlsen exploiting the drawback of Fabi's last move as he maneuvers his bishop into c5. And now the huge threat is bishop c5 to a7, chasing the rook out of b8. And if the rook is chased out of b8, then Fabi's going to lose his b7 pawn, and the b7 pawn anchors the entire queenside. So this is a threat which must be addressed, but Fabi is dropping now to below a minute on the clock. As he looks at both sides intently, you can see the concentration as he tries to find a way to keep his position from falling apart. Bishop a7 is a massive threat, but Fabi finds a nice tactical solution. Rook to d7, creating a potential x-ray. The queen cannot take on b7 because of the prospect of bishop h2 check, so Carlsen stops on a dime and he puts his bishop not on a7, but on b6. That is the hole that was created by Fabi pushing his pawn to a6, and he takes with the queen. A little bit of hesitation there. Carlsen wants to keep his knight in the center. Maybe he wants to jump into e5, and Fabi tries to smoke that queen out of b6. And smoke it out he does, but the queen moves to an even better square. It moves to c5 and it x-rays the knight on d5. And now the big threat is e3, e4, winning the knight on d5. There is a pin against Black's queen on g5, and that is why Fabi plays h6. He does that to defend the queen, to take the sting out of the move e4. Now, Carlsen could play it anyway, but instead he plays b4. He continues expanding on the queen side. But Fabi, he has a very solid position nonetheless. Those pawns on a6 and c6 are preventing the further progress of Carlsen's b pawn. And Carlsen has to keep his foot on the gas pedal because Fabi will continue making improving moves. And he is 30 seconds up on the clock, maybe a little bit of frustration there as Fabi drops his bishop back to h7, a kind of cat and mouse game, both sides making small improving moves. But Fabi, he continues. His clock continues to fade. It continues to dwindle. He just moved his bishop from h7 to g6, a clear sign that Fabi does not know what to do. He is out of improving moves, but he is more than fine to sit if Carlsen does the same. But Carlsen continues to wind his tentacles around Black's position bit by bit. He's improved his knight. Now he plays g3 to tuck his light squared bishop on g2 out of the grasp of Black's queen, and Fabi maneuvers his knight to b5. What a tense position, but Carlsen seems to be making a lot more progress. Fabi going back and forth with his knight. He moves to d6. Carlsen blocks the square with e4, and Fabi jumps back to b5, but now he's putting pressure on Carlsen's center. That d4 pawn is under a lot of fire, and the knight drops back to g4. Now Fabi's queen is on an incredibly awkward square. It's on g6. It's blocking the bishop on h7. The clock is down to 15. Fabi with a little bit of panic there as he plays the move f6 out of necessity. That is a very weakening move, and bang goes the dynamite d5 by Carlsen, blasting through in the center, and the pressure has gotten critical as he doubles his rooks in the d-file. And if the d-file opens, is Fabi's pieces, are they going to be well enough equipped to handle the opening of the position? I don't think so. Rook takes d5 by Carlsen. The pressure continues to grow. Rook dc8. Fabi refuses the rook trade. He keeps both of his rooks to defend the 8th rank. Queen b6 by Carlsen. He threatens now to infiltrate with the move rook to d8. And where is he going to go with his rook? He can also put it on d7. There was something there that was frustrating him as Fabi finally finds a way to move his bishop into the game as he moves it to g8. And now Carlsen's clock is dwindling, and it's down to 20 seconds. A lot of hesitation there from Carlsen, and he moved his rook back to d2. There was something he didn't like about rook d7, and now he improves his knight and moves it to e3. Carlsen trying to continue pressuring, knight e3 to d5. And Fabi offered a queen trade, and the queen's in a standoff, and Carlsen finally accepts it. And finally, after about 30 moves, it's the knight that moves into b6, something we thought would happen a lot earlier. Bishop db3 is both sides in acute time pressure, 20 seconds on the clock for both of them. But what worries me about Black's position here is that pawn on b7. That's a huge weakness. And after knight takes d7, the knight jumps back to c5, and Caruana, he's going to lose the pawn on b7. He's going to lose the pawn on b7. It's attacked by two different pieces. And with that pawn on b7 goes his entire queen side. He's also going to lose a6. Last-ditch attempt by Caruana to create counterplay. Carlsen could not have taken a6 there because of the fork on e2 or a check on f3. Rook e1 is an amazing move in time pressure. And the king moves up to f2, and Caruana cannot take on f4 because of king e3, forking the rook and the knight. What exquisite technique from Carlsen as the king moves out of danger, and now it's on f3. And now I think he can safely take the pawn on a6. But a little bit of hesitation from Carlsen, and take it he does. He takes it with the knight. Caruana still trying to get active with his pieces to create threats. Bishop to c4. How is Carlsen going to manage this final spurt of activity? He goes rook to c1, skewering Black's pieces. Caruana plays rook b3, knight to c5, king to f2, moving out of the discovery, and Carlsen has managed to keep both of his extra pawns intact. He's completely winning as he pushes up to a6, and Caruana continues to try knight a2 and knight c3, and now Carlsen plays rook b3, and a rook trade is deadly for Black. And now black's pieces are getting pushed around. Where is Carlsen's king going to go? It shifts away to f3. Another check on e2, and the king moves up to e4. This is absolutely amazing technique by Carlsen. He is not giving Fabi a single chance, but Fabi continues to harass him. Bishop e2 to c4. There is a nasty check on e2, which he might deliver, and he goes g6. He's trying to set up a mating net. Rook e2 check is incredibly unpleasant, and Carlsen's pawns, for the time being, are somehow immobilized by black's pieces. As he moves his rook back from g3 to g1, attacking the knight, knight f2 check, king e3, and the knight takes the pawn on h3, and Caruana has almost reestablished material equality, but now his knight is completely out of the game. And rook a3 check, and Carlsen continues to get annoyed. Bishop b3, bishop takes a6. He's won another pawn, but rook h1 traps the knight, and he takes the knight. And Caruana takes the bishop, but king d4 wins the bishop on b3. The bishop cannot move because the rook is going to be lost in a shake of hands from Caruana. What a game by Carlsen. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these videos. Thank you so much for watching.